Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Zoom series entitled Conversations for Our Times. You know, we try to, as a parish, we want to be aware of what's going on around us in the world, to have, educated ideas and to listen to those of expertise to help us in our discernment of what it is to live as a Christian in this really complicated world that we find ourselves. So I'd like to begin with, first of all, a statement of welcome and a land acknowledgement. So we begin by saying that at St. Basil's Parish, we regard the love of God to be the foundation of all life and ministry. We believe in the ever-present love of God as witnessed through Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. We believe that each and every person is loved by God and is of sacred worth. Therefore, through God's grace, we welcome everyone that comes to our parish. Further, we express God's hospitality by creating a safe, healing, accessible, and transforming place for all who come here, who are a part of our community. Also, we'd like to acknowledge that our parish is built on the land that was inhabited by the Algonquin First Nation. Their presence here on this land reaches back to time immemorial, more than 10,000 years. And we have gratitude and respect that we gather here on their unsurrendered land. And we honor their long history. They have a long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we want to uphold and to uplift the voice and values of the Algonquin people. So now I'm going to turn ourselves over to Kevin, who will talk about housekeeping details.
Yes, it's very simple. Welcome, everybody. Please, I'm just sending you. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Any questions that we have in today's session, please send your question to me via the chat box. I've just sent a note to everybody saying, please send your questions to me. Please use that. The question and answer period at the end of this session, the second half of this session, will be moderated. Our intention, we are called Conversations for Our Times, and our intention to have as much of a dialogue through your questions as we can at the second part of today's session. So please send your questions directly to me so we can sort them out. Don't wait till the end. As soon as the question comes up, pop it in, and I'll be scooping them all up and then organizing them according to theme and sequence. So I thank you for doing that. And I now go back to Father Winkler, who is going to introduce today's guest. Father Winkler, please.
I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Doris Kieser. She is a theologian. You know, the work of theologians is really challenging. It's to reflect on, the things that are going on in our world through the perspective of Catholic teaching. And the reflection involves research of the past. It looks into future and present, all of these things. It's an exciting field of human research and discovery. And Dr. Doris Kieser has been doing this most of her adult life. She's been a theologian. And I remember I worked with her. I didn't work with her. I worked near her. My office was beside hers when I was at St. Joseph's College in Edmonton. I was there for 2 years, and she was in her office every morning at 6 a.m. doing her work. She's dedicated to theology, through theological reflection, to real study and research. And she's, and through my perspective, she's an incredibly gifted person because of her dedication to helping us understand the world about us through the lens of, well, not only Catholic faith, but also, more importantly, also in this day and age, through the lens of can I say, women. And she is the associate professor at St. Joseph's College in Edmonton. She's been there for a number of years now, and she's also the associate dean at St. Joseph's College. She's which is the Catholic College at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Her focus is on ethics, and in theology, She looks at the areas of bioethics, sexuality, the body, the human body, spirituality. And really all of this is done so that we can have reflections on what does it mean for human flourishing. That's the goal, that we flourish in this world through discussion of spirituality, ethics, theological reflection, and so forth. Doris is particularly committed to the work of social justice in her writing, and also to the well-being of females. So I'm really pleased that Doris is with us, and God bless her for being with us, and to talk about today sexuality and Catholic thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Darold, and thank you, Kevin, for those lovely starting off points. So I am going to just share my screen because I have a PowerPoint and it's not super dense or anything. It's just something that will help you to follow me along in the work that I'm doing. So this opening slide, I just want to talk a little bit about it. This is on the poster I use for the course I teach on the human sexual body. And as you can see, there's a lot of bodies on there. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do today with regards to sexuality, certainly in Catholic theology, but generally speaking, is to reclaim the connection of our sexual and spiritual selves and how our bodies play into that. So I love all of these images because they just really are so diverse and so a part of what it means to be a human person. So I'm going to start off today with a little quotation from, oh, that wasn't what I wanted to do. A little quotation from an article by Fran Furter and John Hegel, from an article they wrote on sexuality. And it says, human sexuality is the divine energy of creativity and love, as it is manifested in wonderfully diverse forms in the cosmos, and as it becomes conscious and intentional in human relationships for the purpose of giving life and deepening the community. And the reason I'm using this citation is that it's giving us a sense of what sexuality is and the way that it's connected to our relationship with God. So human sexuality is something that is given to us by God, and that divine energy of creativity, you notice that they say creativity, not procreativity. So that creativity is that it's life-giving through loving, but not necessarily through having children, although that's one way, obviously, of being creative in our sexuality. And it is manifested in wondrously diverse forms, meaning that we understand it to be not just one thing, but it can be many things to many different people. And of course, all of these differences, these diverse ways of being sexual, are creations of God. And so what does that mean for us as we make our way through the world? And then it says, as it becomes conscious and intentional in human relationships. So what we mean by conscious and intentional is that we think about our sexuality and we live out our sexuality in a way that is not just willy-nilly and directed towards the first thing that comes along. We grow into it, we become aware of it in ways that perhaps are new to us over the course of time, but we're also very focused in doing that in a way that is consonant with how we see ourselves in the world. So it's conscious and intentional, and it's in human relationships, which means that we don't do this only for ourselves. Our sexuality is a part and parcel of our broader sense of what it means to be around people, loving people. And it's for the purpose. So saying that it has a purpose also says that it has meaning. Right? So it means something to us. It's not like some It's not an appendix, which we could remove if we wanted to. It's very focused on some specific part of being human. And that specific part is the giving life and deepening communion. And so giving life, again, can be in the form of procreation and having babies, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And deepening communion obviously means our relationship not only with our fellow humans, but also with God and with our own selves. So our human sexuality has everything to do with our day-to-day walking through the world. It's not something that we put on a shelf. It's not something completely separated from our spirituality. It is rather very integrated into who we are. I always love this image. I throw it in there just because I love it. And it's from Henri Matisse, his dance video, or not video, portrait. And I think it just sort of illustrates, the joy that comes with just being bodies in relationship with the divine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Christian sexuality and spirituality. And the reason I'm doing this, even though it might seem like, oh, this has nothing to do with sexuality, in the Catholic Church, and in particular in the teachings of the Catholic Church, so, what you might find through teachings in the Vatican, through catechism, and to a certain extent in theology, and throughout the course of history, Christian history, if we look at the way that we understand what it means to be human, we find that playing out in Christian and Catholic teachings around sexuality. And I'll talk a little bit about this, and I'm going to guess that you're going to recognize how this looks in our contemporary discourse, because we're having conversations for our times. And so I want to talk about what are known as dualisms or binaries. And overall, what this is an attempt to divide the human experience into contrasting pairs. So sexuality, spirituality, nature, culture, emotion, reason. And you judge one aspect of that pair more negatively and the other aspect more positively than the other. And why is this important? Well, they get played out in how historically we've understood what it means to be male or masculine or female and feminine. And what we find is that traits like sexuality, nature, emotion, the body, being receptive, being female, have over the course of history been considered lesser than the other traits, and very much associated with females. And then on the other side, we've got spirituality, culture, reason, the mind, being assertive, being male. Those characteristics, again, sort of assigned to males over the course of history. And you can find this in, all kinds of places, not the least of which is Pope John Paul II's theology of the body. But these attributes, divided as they are as male and female, and because they have been judged more positively on the male side and more negatively on the female side, they've had a real impact on how we see sexuality, how we see what it means to be sexed as a male or a female or intersex, what it means to be gendered. So there's all kinds of ways in which these two understandings of what it means to be human in the human experience, when we divide these up, what does that look like? So we get to the notion of theological anthropology. So the implications of these dualisms, these pairs, is that we have a way of thinking about what it means to be in light of our relationship with God, or born in God's image. So when we say theological, we're talking about what does it mean to be in relationship with God. And then when we say anthropology, we're just saying, what does it mean to be human? And so over the course of Christian history, and this actually predates Christian history, it all goes all the way back into, various different other cultural understandings like Greek philosophy, where that notion of being sexed and gendered, so being either male and masculine or female and feminine, has a long history in understanding human relationships. And then we put that in the context of a relational community, which means here we are. In our Catholic community, we're in relationship. In all of the all of the relationships that we're in outside of that, we're always in various kinds of relationships. Some of them intimate, some of them transitory, some of them passing, some of them transactional, some of them just very useful. But we're always in a relationship. And over the course of time, we've assumed ways of being female in relationships and ways of being male, or being feminine and being masculine. So that in and of itself might not be so bad, except that sometimes it has some negative implications. And so if you're wondering, why am I telling you about dualisms? We'll get to that in terms of some of the implications with regards to issues around sexuality, like same-sex marriage or being trans, being bisexual, all of the ways in which we think about how it means to be together as human persons. So I always like to throw this in just to shake things up a little bit. So in sexuality and spirituality, as the dualisms sort of played themselves out, there was this separation, and you can see this in people like St. Augustine in particular. He was very bad for this, where he put his spirituality up against his sexuality and basically thought, I can't be a sexual person and be a spiritual person at the same time. Now, I'm not going to comment on what was going on in Augustine's mind at the time, lots of things. But he clearly struggled with his own sexuality in relationship to his sense of himself as a Christian. And his solution was, in some ways, to just cut that sexuality off. Didn't work, but in his mind, that's what he thought he needed to do. But I'm going to take you here to the 1600s. And this is an image of St. Teresa of Avila, a sculpture by Bernini, and it's in the Cornaro Chapel at Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. So if you ever go to Rome, I highly recommend that you see it. But in this sculpture, this is a sculpture that's taken directly from St. Teresa's journals, her autobiography of her life. And this is her moment of mystical union with God. And in this, and this is very clearly depicting what she's experiencing as she's written it out. But it's clear that this is a very physical experience, like she's having a direct experience of God, and she sees it very physically. So there's a little piece from her Life of St. Teresa that I'm just going to read that describes exactly this moment and how her spirituality and her sexuality and her body are so connected. So I quote her here. I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the iron's point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual, though the body has a share in it. It is a caressing of love so sweet, which now takes place between the soul and God, that I pray God of his goodness to make him experience it, who may think that I am lying. So this image here is basically trying to depict this particular moment. And as you could hear, Saint Teresa describing this mystical moment, it's quite bodily and it's quite sexual. And this strain of the connection of the spiritual and the sexual has been a part of the Christian tradition for a long time. It predates Saint Teresa of Avila, but this is probably the most obvious example of what that might look like in art. I mean, there's all kinds of examples of it over the course of Christian art history, but this one is probably the most prominent. So we're going to move a little from that historical view of sex and sexuality and gender and sex, although gender itself is a fairly recent word. We don't see that in the history of Christian theology. So the idea that we had these very strict notions of masculine and feminine, that's a fairly recent understanding, although there is a lot of discussion of the ways in which sex dictates how a person should dress and behave. So we know that it's just not called gender. So in our contemporary Christian theologies, and this includes in terms of church teaching, we understand sex and sexuality as inherently good in and of themselves. There's nothing wrong with them. They don't need redemption. They're part of the human experience and they're created by God. And they are God's gift to us. So we don't need to redeem them through procreation. And that's a little bit of a strain in Christian history as well, that somehow sexuality and the drive and the pleasure that came from that needed to be somehow tamed by procreation. And we see some of that in the church teachings around, like in Humanae Vitae, for instance, where the discussion is that sexuality should always be accompanied by a physical openness to procreation. But having said that, the reality is that most sex is not ultimately procreative. And not all sexual expression is geared towards having babies. Because if it were, we'd have a lot of babies and we wouldn't know where to put them all. So again, our sexuality is inherent to us as human persons and who we are as persons. The side of this, and we know that sexuality can also be harmful and hurtful. And part of this is because, like any other human attribute, sexuality is subject to evil expressions. And by that, I mean expressions of abuse or violence or inattention or indifference, manipulation, power, commodification. So selling sex, manipulating people with sex, harming people with sex, using sex to exert power over other people. These are a part and parcel of human, well, I'm going to say stupidity, but also sinfulness, depending on how you want to talk about it. So sexuality itself is good, but like every other gift that humans share, it is subject to our own bad choices and our own evil use of that gift. What we also say in our contemporary Christian theologies is that we like to see our sexuality unified in the body, the mind, the soul, and the spirit towards human flourishing. So what that means is, unlike in that dualistic understanding of things like mind over body or spirit over body, or culture over nature, we're trying to understand the human person and our various attributes with no hierarchy. So not one is better than the other. They're very different, but they all are integrated and they inform each other. So for instance, if you want to understand human spirituality, you have to be in a body, because we're not just little souls floating around. our human experience, and who knows what happens after we die, what that looks like, because I haven't died, so I don't know. But our human experience is embodied. The only way that we know the world, and knowing has to do with our mind, the only way that we know the world is through our body, through our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch. That's all embodied. And that is our first experience of the world. And that goes into our mind and into our soul and into our spirit. So that all of those things rely on one another in their human development, right? So sexuality and spirituality in that front, they inform one another. So how I see myself as a spiritual person might have an impact on how I see myself as a sexual person, how I respond in the world sexually. And my sexuality might also have a way of informing my spirituality. So my senses, my intellect, my emotion, my spirit, the way I understand the world, the way I make judgments about my behaviors and the things that are happening around me, my reflection and the ways that I love are all integrated into our spiritual sexual person. And so we're really trying hard. I just lost there we go. We're really trying hard to understand our sexuality and spirituality in the ways in which they inform one another. So now we've gotten to Pope Francis, and Father Daryl asked me to speak a little bit about Pope Francis and how he understands sexuality and spirituality and flourishing. And the truth of it is, Pope Francis hasn't said very much about this. Unlike, Pope Benedict didn't say much about it either while he was a pope. He wrote one encyclical on what it means to love and the various types of love. But while he was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, so the folks who write the moral teachings, while he was in charge of that, there was a lot that came out on sexuality. And obviously, Pope John Paul II wrote a lot about sex and gender and sexuality in his Theology of the Body. And so, expecting perhaps to follow up on that, people wonder what Pope Francis is saying about sexuality. Well, his one very famous statement about sexuality was, who am I to judge? When he was asked in an interview about how he understands same-sex marriages and relationships and people who are in loving relations, and he basically said, who am I to judge? Because he really had nothing else that he wanted to say. He has made statements that are that focus in some ways on those gender categories of male and female and masculine and feminine. And he says a lot of that in particular around women in the priesthood. And he calls on those issues. But that is referring back to Pope John Paul's theology of what it means to be male and female, which is pretty set in stone. So for Pope Francis, his real issue with regards to questions of sex and gender has to do with social justice and diversity. So the biggest part of his papacy, I'm going to suggest, is an engagement, an encounter with those on the margins, the poor and the vulnerable. And we can be on the margins in many, many different ways, not just about sex and gender, but about poverty, if we're migrants, if we're refugees, if we're lepers, if we're gender diverse, if we're sex diverse, if all of those things are going on. For Pope Francis, the call is for us as Christians to go to the margins and encounter the people on the margins. That's the Christian message. That's what he would say Christ is doing. Do I think he's going to be blessing same-sex marriages any day? He might. I don't know. He's getting older and he's not altogether well, so it might not happen during his papacy, but it could if he lived for 20 years. So, but I don't know that he's going to live for 20 years. So Pope Francis has been, he's gone, rather than saying something straightforward or different from previous popes, what he's inviting people to do is to think about these questions from a different angle, as opposed to just focusing on who's having sex with who and when are they having sex and what's happening in that sex. He's not really, it seems to me, interested in those questions. One last slide I'm going to share, and then I'm going to stop so we can get into questions and whatnot. This is just some terminology around contemporary discussions around sex and gender and sexuality. So those terms, gender and sex, currently right now, people in the sciences, the humanities, fine arts, liberal arts, and including theology, don't really agree on what those mean. And you can see this playing out in society around people being careful about introducing things like, trans, student, safe spaces, gay, straight alliances. What does it mean to have a gender? Is our gender and sex intrinsic to who we are as human people? Can we change our gender? Can we change our sex? Is it possible that we would be born into a body that doesn't feel like our body? Like, this is not the body I belong to. So those are all parts of the discussions. And if you have questions about that, we can get into that. But I want to just identify a few terms that might be helpful. So the first is cisgender, or sometimes just referred to as cis. And this is about people who remain in their born sex category. So I'm a cisgender female, which means I was born female, I'm still female, I identify as female. If I were born male, stayed male, identified as male, or intersex, any of those actual categories, if we don't see any disagreement between how we see those in our physical presentation, that would make us cisgender or cis. So if you hear that, that's what that's about. Transgender, or often just trans, are people who have transitioned away from, and they do this in varying degrees. Not everybody goes through a full gender reassignment. Not everybody has surgery. Some people stay in their bodies, but they identify as another sex. So people who have transitioned away from their born sex category towards their self-understood sex category. So you might see that MTF, male to female. So somebody who was born male understands themselves as male and somehow transitions to being female. And then the other side of that, you could be born female, transition to male. This particular category doesn't account for folks who are intersex. So people who are born with sex characteristics from both male and female. So they're not actually born male, they're not actually born female, and they are born intersex. And there's a lot of different physical manifestations of that, how that looks. But their gender or sex is not immediately identifiable. And so that's what we would refer to as intersex. Non-binary are basically people who don't see themselves as limited to either gender or sex categories. So it doesn't matter what their sex category is as they were born female, don't really identify as female, don't really identify as male. I can be both, I can be either. So they don't see themselves as sitting on a spectrum. They see them, or on the ends of a spectrum. They see themselves sort of sitting in the middle of a spectrum or somewhere on the spectrum, but not necessarily this or this, nor do they want to be necessarily this or this. And then queer, and You know, some of you out there might be queer, non-binary, trans, probably lots of you are cisgender. You might want to comment or ask questions about this to clarify your own definition of that. But queer generally refers to people who are gender fluid or fluid in their sexual attractions and desires. So they don't really gravitate in one direction. They might not be strictly heterosexual. They might not be strictly homosexual. They're sort of all over the map for themselves. And queer is a word that was claimed back as a slur against people. It used to be something that was a denigration of people who were homosexual. So they were called queer. And then back in the 70s and 80s, that word started getting reclaimed so that they identify in that way. And it gives a sort of a broad spectrum of what is possible. So that is my last slide. So I am going to stop sharing there and come back to the group. And at this point, I'm open to questions. So hopefully you've been madly typing your questions away to Kevin, and he's got a collection of questions for me, or thoughts or reflections, and we can have some nice conversation.
Okay, thank you, Doris. Now, as I'm preparing to get organized on that, can I start with one question? You
Sure.
say the only way we know is through the body.
Yeah.
As a cisgender male who grew up in the Catholic culture of the 1950s, I would translate that as to say the only way I knew was about the body was what I was taught within that culture. And much of what you have said is this wonderful great undoing of that. And what I mean by that is that those of us who came through the system in the 1950s and into the 60s would have gone through marriage preparation and have been told what the expectation was of that marriage. And so so much of this presentation is an undoing of a way of thinking that is so deeply, deeply ingrained. So the question is, what do you do with people like me, people of a certain age, listening and watching today, who feel that there's a lot of undoing that has to happen now, and a lot of relearning that has to happen now to enter this non-binary, non-either or world that you portrayed?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. There are so many diverse ways of being in the world, and the undoing is not so much undoing for the sake of undoing, it's undoing some of the harmful ways of thinking about what it means to be a sexual person. So that if we're born into a culture that says, yes, you get married and then you have babies and you marry someone of the opposite sex, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. And for a lot of people, that makes perfect sense, right? So it's not the undoing of that in and of itself, it's the undoing of an understanding that says that's the only way we can be happy as sexual persons in the world. So if you think about all the years in which we didn't really recognize the validity of same-sex relationships, right? All of those people who were same-sex attracted and wound up in opposite-sex relationships were harmed by that. And they were harming other people at the same time, right? Not intentionally, obviously, but by living something that wasn't truly who they knew themselves to be. And so we're in a world where we're sort of opening up the possibilities for loving, right? As opposed to closing down everything that's existed in the past, we can look at those things and say, you know, there are some really beautiful things about that. But there are also other ways of being beautifully in love and sexually connected with other people. So I wouldn't want to encourage people to dismantle their whole lives, maybe just to reflect on ways in which they could see things differently for other people, right? To open themselves to that diversity a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Technical question.
Yes.
What does intersex mean?
So sorry, I dropped something there. So when we talk about intersex, we're talking about people who are born biologically with no determinate sex. So people might have sexual organs or genitalia that don't match, right? So they have no uterus, but they do have a vagina, but they can't reproduce because the way that their body is constructed has more male characteristics, male reproductive characteristics than female, or vice versa. So what it just means is that we've always thought, oh, well, you know, we've got male and we've got female, but the reality is that's not all we've got. We've got a lot of people who are born with no definable sex on that binary. And historically, it used to be that if someone was born intersex, they were immediately, there was surgery, the parents would pick a sex for them, and that child would be raised as either male or female. Typically, it was female because it's a lot easier to construct a body as a female than it is to construct a body as a male. So if there was something ambiguous, they would just default towards female. But what they recognized was happening was people were growing up not really identifying with the sex that their parents had chosen for them. So today the practice is far different. The practice is more just to allow that child to grow into their sexuality, whatever that is. And as they get older, see how they want to identify themselves. And it most of the time, they're fine being intersex. Most people are comfortable with that rather than having to choose a sex one way or another. So it's sort of, now here's the thing about how that makes it difficult for the church. The church makes no space for that in its theology, and yet it's a reality. So how do we fit that into a theology of sexuality? Because it's real and it's true, but we have no way of talking about that in the current teachings of the church and the theology in the church. And I think if you go back to the Genesis account of creation, where God created earth and sky, God created land and sea, God created male and female, light and dark. How we interpret that story, and this goes into the theology of the body by Pope John Paul, how we interpret that story really has an impact on how we see what it means to be sexual and in relationships. And if we interpret that story as there's male and there's female, there's night and there's dark, or light and dark, if we see those as all dualisms, as only opposites, then there's no way of accounting for whatever might be in the middle. But we don't see the world that way. We don't see the world as only light or dark. There's dusk, there's dawn, there's, hazy, smoky days. There's days that are less clear than others. And so we make space for the ambiguity of creation in just about every realm of creation, but human sexuality. And so that tends to be a bit difficult as well, because that's a very real human experience, that ambiguity. So, yeah.
Thank you. I was just typing a question, putting two questions together. We have a cluster of questions that relate to the issue of transition male, female, female, male. Yeah. And there's clearly an initial focus on that in these questions. So the first question is to ask, will you please comment? This person has seen interviews involving quite young people talking about choosing another gender, and perhaps this is a question about, is this too young? This is a childhood. This is this is an adolescence issue. Does an adolescent, what kind of guidance might be needed in that setting? So let's talk about that first issue of discomfort with a younger person expressing discomfort over their gender.
Yeah, I mean, so gosh, as someone who works with adolescents a lot and adolescents who see themselves as trans, my experience is that, like any other issue that people encounter in adolescence, it's varied among the young people. And so for many of them, it's absolutely that they see themselves as not this sex, not this gender, or that they have great discomfort with being in this gender. I think some of the concerns that people have are about, somehow we're forcing kids into choosing a sex, or that there are people who are saying, yeah, you can just choose. And I don't know that that's necessarily the reality on the ground. I think the reality is more that young people are experiencing some confusion around their sex and gender. And part of that has to do with the fact that we really have a history in North America in particular, and this is coming out again as we're seeing across North America, where if you are male, you should be like this. You should look like this, you should dress like this, you should act like this, even though we say that we don't do that. And if you are female, you should look like this, you should dress like this, you should act like this. And so part of the discomfort is not 100% with their body, but with the way that they perceive that they have to present themselves in the world, right? And a transition, people transition in various different ways. Some of them have full surgical transitions, some have top transitions, some have top and bottom transitions, some have no physical transitions at all, no surgical transitions, some take hormones, some don't. So the ways in which we talk about transition is not really nuanced, and the reality is quite nuanced. And so I can't really comment on all kids, all adolescents everywhere, because what exactly is happening is going to vary across each individual person. And it also is going to vary by the way that their family understands them, right? And the ways in which they relate in their family. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. There's another question that relates to this that is really touching on what I think we now know from media is called gender theory. Mm-hmm. And the question is, this kind of vocabulary can be quite ideological. Is this change of sex through medical procedures, how grounded in science is this?
Right. So, okay. So I think the way of talking about gender, like that notion of gender ideology, the church actually uses that a lot to dismiss things like feminism and to prop up things like why women shouldn't be priests, and people who are saying, oh, women could be priests, they're like, oh no, that's gender ideology. But in terms of transitioning, there's not a lot of data around young people transitioning. So what the long-term impact of that is, right? And again, young people a transition looks very different depending on the kid. Not everyone is I Am Jazz on TV, right? If you're familiar with that television show about a young woman who transitioned from male over the course of their time on the show. Not all people transition in that way, so it's hard to say. But the data with regards to adults who transition, because adults have been transitioning for a lot longer, and again, in different ways. But the data around adults is actually that most adults who transition are actually happier and feel more comfortable as themselves after a transition. So that's adults. I don't know about young people, because like I said, it's very recent that these options, even like beta block or puberty blockers and those kinds of things that might facilitate a transition or put off a person who is not comfortable in their sex, going through puberty and adopting all of those sex characteristics that come with puberty. For some of those folks, just the puberty blockers seem to be okay, but not for everyone. So yeah, it's a mixed bag with young people, and the data is not clear yet. The data is a little more robust around adults and what happens with adults who transition.
I want to ask one more question on this, and then we'll move to a different theme.
Okay.
So this then, I'm paraphrasing the question, but so this then is a contemporary issue. I mean, I think that there's a sense that this is very much a concern of our time. Would you say that you talked about medication, you talked about procedures, contemporary shift toward that, but I would presume that discomfort with sexual identity, discomfort with gender is not a 20th century phenomenon.
No, I would suggest not. I mean, I haven't done the historical research, so, I can't really say, but I suspect in the same way, homosexuality has been around since the dawn of time. Same-sex partners, lovers, that stuff has been around forever. But we don't have a lot of record of it because it was considered, depending on where you were, it was considered unnatural or abnormal or against the law, dangerous. And so I expect that people not being comfortable in their own skin has been around a long time too. But I also think that part of what contributes to that is a social understanding of sex and gender as very, there's only one way of being male and one way of being female. And so, and I don't know that that's a global phenomenon. I mean, it's certainly a Western phenomenon. But it might well be that it's not global to all human people, right? It might be that historically, people would dress and act and behave in the opposite sex in lots of different cultures in different ways that were perfectly socially acceptable. I don't know, because I haven't done the research. But I think it might be also because in the West, we do have a very strong commitment to masculinity and femininity, even though we're coming out of that, right? Like, we don't like men wearing dresses unless they're saying mass. Well, do you know what I mean? Right? So we don't like it. It grates against how we see what it means to be a man in Western culture. That has not always been the case, but it is the case now. And so those kinds of things also play into the way that we see things. And like, if we think about the church and the ways, like, the church has been very embedded in Western culture for 2000 years, over 2000 years. Well, more embedded for about 1700 years, but And it took on a lot of when we sort of made our way into the Western world in a real kind of way in the 300s, we took on a lot of what the Roman Empire had to offer us in terms of structure and politics and whatnot. And so the church and the state were very closely intertwined. And so ideas about gender and sex were also very political while they were religious, right? So the theology of the church has evolved along with the politics, and those things develop together. It's not like the church developed in a vacuum, and it's not like the political systems of the world developed in a vacuum. They were very intertwined. And so our theology today also has a lot to do with how we culturally see ourselves in the world.
Okay, thank you. 2 definitional questions, and then I'm going to move on to a different theme.
Sure.
Is non-binary and queer the same thing?
It depends who you ask. For some people, these are labels, right? And the labels develop as a way of self-identification. So are they the same thing? Not always, but could be. They are similar, and they do denote, like non-binary typically talks about self-identity, like not really identifying as male or female, whereas queer tends to be more identifying with sexual attraction, or historically has. Now, I'm not queer and I'm not non-binary, so it's hard for me to say, definitively one way or another if they're the same or they're not. But historically, they have been a little bit separate.
Okay, this next question is also about the meaning of words. Can you comment on the difference between gender expression or gender identification and sexual orientation?
Okay, so the way that we have historically talked about sexual orientation, it refers specifically to whom we are sexually attracted, right? So that means externally, who am I attracted to? And if I'm straight, I'm attracted to someone who's the opposite sex. If I'm gay, lesbian, bisexual, I might be attracted to same sex or both. Gender identity is about how I see myself as a sexed and gendered person, right? Not necessarily who I'm attracted to, but how I understand myself. So it's inwardly focused as opposed to outwardly focused.
Okay, we're going to a few questions that are, I would call the big theology bit.
Sure, yeah.
So the church has worked very hard to support a scientific truth, and after 400 years admitted that it was wrong. For example, the trial of Galileo. The question is this: do you think the church will become more adept at rescinding its support for positions on sexuality that ignore science?
Oh gosh, that is a really good question. If I were to say on the theological front, like the church is it's not a speed racing institution. It's more like an iceberg. And so it moves very, very slowly. I don't even think right now. And so when we talk about church, I guess we start with, what do we mean by church? Do we mean the people of God? Do we mean the hierarchy of the church? And how do those two things interact? But if we're talking about the hierarchy of the church, it would seem to me that many of the folks in the hierarchy of the church, including bishops, cardinals, and I might have to include Pope Francis in this, I don't know, but certainly Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II, they didn't see themselves as wrong in the face of science. So like, if you look at the Canadian Catholic bishops haven't really said a lot on this as a unit, but the American bishops have. And they're like, they don't see themselves as wrong at all. Like, they don't see themselves as missing the science. They think it's all balderdash. They're very committed to that. So will they be more adept at making that change? I think it would first require that they see that there is a change to be made. And I don't know, will that happen in my lifetime? Maybe, maybe not. I also think on the papal front, like if you look at the history of the church, the 2,000-year history, like it did take 400 years to go, oh, Galileo was right. We live in a heliocentric universe. It took us 400 years to say that. So will it take us 400 years to say there is nothing disordered about being same-sex attracted? I don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But the language that the church uses is also, it's not the scientific language. When they say disorder, they don't mean like the DSM disorder. It comes off that way because that's the context of the language today. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And it is like, if you want to know what a psychiatric diagnosis is, you go to this book and it's got it all in there. Homosexuality used to be in there. It is no longer in there. But when they talk about disorders, they're talking about psychiatric disorders. And homosexuality used to be considered a psychiatric disorder, and it's not. But when the church says disorder, they're going back to medieval categories of how we are, as created beings, directed towards what it is we're supposed to be. So the disorder is that, oh, okay, well, human beings are supposed to be, for instance, procreative. And since same-sex partners can't procreate, then that's a disorder of what it means to be human. They're not talking there about, sexuality and an insight into human sexuality. They're talking about the ways in which we are ordered in God's creation. It's a little bit different. So will the church change that? I mean, we live in hope, right? But I don't know. I don't know that they will, like, in my lifetime. Another thing about the popes is that the popes, Pope John Paul, who, really put that theology of the body on the map and that notion of complementarity, that males are made for females and females are made for males. And look at that. You can just look at their bodies and you can see that females are receptive and males are assertive, and all of that sort of extrapolated towards sex. And it's a very difficult theology to work with in human experience. But he's not dead that long. It's not even 20 years. So for Pope Francis to say, well, Pope John Paul was wrong, he is just not going to do that. He's just not going to do that. And so this may be, the ways in which in the church, this moving like an iceberg may be as a way of the church just working itself out of its own mistakes.
This next question flows right out of that. I mean, you just used the expression intrinsically disordered, and the use of those two words. Yeah. So the question is, would you say that the teachings, and I would add, and the language of the church are essentially homophobic? And if so, what would it take to change the direction of such teachings?
Gosh, okay, so let me just clarify. So the teaching of the church is not that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered. It's disordered. But what is intrinsically disordered are homosexual behaviors, not homosexuality itself. So acting on a same-sex impulse is intrinsically disordered, but being gay is not. which is why the church always says, we can't discriminate, right? Is the church homophobic, or are the teachings of the church homophobic? In some ways, I think yes. And I think partly because they're clinging to a way of thinking about the world that is not as viable in contemporary society as it was 500 years ago. So what I mean by that is, we no longer live in this classicist worldview that says we can find things that are universally true for all places and all times around the human experience, right? And there are some things that, we would say love is good. I think that's a universal truth. But to say same-sex relationships are always evil might not be one of those universal truths. And so that classicist, that worldview that has a hard time getting away from the idea that this is right and it will always be right forever and ever, amen, versus a worldview that says, well, we have to look at those truths that we've taught for so long and put them in the context of how the world is changing, because science informs us, not just science, but art and literature and the humanities and theology and philosophy, like all of the ways in which we continue to learn as a human community inform what we do in terms of the church and the ways in which we see ourselves in the church. So there have been many instances in which the church has sort of pulled back their teachings on moral issues. Like one of them is usury, right? We used to say, oh my gosh, loaning money for interest is evil and wrong. Now we have an entire financial system based on that. And nobody's calling the bankers up and going, well, this is morally wrong, right? But we're very, very concerned about who's having sex with whom. And so are those teachings homophobic? I think they're coming from a place that is less concerned with the reality of the human experience and more concerned with constructing a system of thought that is cohesive, because it's a little easier to do that when you don't have to pay attention to the data. But when you start paying attention to the data, things get messy, right? Moral decision-making and moral thinking is messy. It always is, because it's hard. And so if it's easier to say, no, this is always going to be wrong in every place and every time, then, we might default to that as a way of enforcing. And let me also say that I think that in the context of the church and the development of those teachings, for the most part, the people who are writing this stuff and thinking this stuff, they're coming from a place of deep love. And they think this is the loving thing to do, right? And maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right. I mean, I guess I'll know when I'm dead. But those folks, like I think of Pope Benedict, he was coming from a place where he really wanted to embrace truth. And I think, some of the stuff that came out of his papacy and that preceded him in Pope John Paul's papacy, and we'll probably see this after Pope Francis is gone as well, is that they're coming from a place of love and they did the best that they could do with what they had.
Okay, let's turn that around.
Okay.
That's where they are coming from. Where are we as church? Where are we as community? Where are we coming from in this? So it's our behavior. I mean, for example, we know that many of us struggle with pronouns. What's the correct one to use, or the correct 2 or 3 to use? What is the right acronym to use? And we would be very, very, very careful about language. So what do we find ourselves in theology that will help us as a community? And here's the question: when hateful acts and hateful words are directed against anyone who identifies differently than a traditional male, female, man, woman model?
So, I mean, I don't think it's ever acceptable to fling hate at someone. I mean, I don't care how different they are, especially for somebody around something like gender, because, you know, if people are really just sort of living out the way they see themselves in the world, I don't know how that is harmful to me, for instance. Now, for some people, they see that as an attack on, you know, society and our social structure and whatnot. But I don't think that being hateful and saying hateful things to other people is going to advance our understanding of one another. So it might be that if I'm not familiar with someone's pronouns and I use a pronoun that I think is appropriate and it's not, and they say to me, oh, by the way, I'm not she, her, I'm they, them. Then I go, oh, okay. So, because it doesn't harm me, right? To speak to them the way they want to be spoken to. People change their names all the time. And if somebody says to me, no, don't call me Doris anymore, call me by my middle name, Marie, call me Bob, whatever. That's not about me. That's about them. And so they can have that. That's me speaking there. Not everybody is like that. But I think the key is to just listen, really, and to ask, oh, you know, I've like this whole pronoun thing, it is very confusing. And there's nothing wrong with saying, oh, you know, I'm a bit confused. Can you clarify for me what that means for you? Because I want to be respectful of you, but I don't understand it. And I don't think that's an unfair question, right? I think that's far more productive than, you know, saying terrible things to a person because we don't understand what their experience is. So I think that's a Christian calling. I think we start with that. I think we start with the dignity of the person that comes from our equal creation in the image of God. And if we can humble ourselves to say, we are created in God's image, God is not created in our image. We can humble ourselves to say, if God created this, it is God's creation.
Okay. How then?
Okay.
How do we as a community, how do we move forward as Catholics if or when our views differ from those of the church in this area of sexuality? So again, it's turning it around. Where are we with this?
Right. So I think in the church, it is helpful to have conversations, right? Like if I know in Alberta, we had a lot of conversation around how to accommodate trans kids in schools with bathrooms and whatnot. And it was a difficult conversation because neither side was being terribly dialogical. And so from the perspective of the people in the church, what happened was teachers who were on the front lines were like, we just want the kids to be safe and happy and learn. And then we've got people advocating on the outside or really calling out the church for bad practices. And then we've got the hierarchical church going, well, but we have to stick by the teachings. I think we have to sit down and talk to people. And in fact, that's exactly what Pope Francis is saying about a culture of encounter, right? If you're in a school district where there's lots of division, you know, how do you advocate for conversation among people who disagree? And, you know, you find somebody who's a good facilitator and you say, this is the conversation we want to have. We don't know how to do it ourselves. Can you facilitate that? Can you allow us, can you help us to have a conversation that's going to bring us to an understanding? Because if I'm coming from a Catholic and a Christian perspective, that's my goal, right? Is to, I don't have to agree, but I can't hate without understanding, right? If that's all I bring to the table, it's not very useful.
In a news conference last week, Pope Francis said, or this is reported, being homosexual is not a crime. It is not a crime. Yes, but it is a sin. First, let's make a distinction between sin and crime. But it's also a sin to lack charity toward another. So what about that? End of quote. So again, it pushes it back to us and our role in this.
In that quotation, he was really referring, there are many sort of nation states around the world that have criminalized homosexuality and homosexual behavior. And he was speaking to that because a lot of those nations are Catholic or have a very large Catholic contingency. And he's trying to say, like, you cannot criminalize people for who they are, right? Is it a sin? Well, yeah, sure. You can talk about it like a sin, but and this is where Pope Francis, he's done this a lot, where he says, yes, but the sin of lack of charity, right? The sin of not being able to be present to those among us is a far more serious sin than the sin of somebody, being homosexual or not. It's not sinful to be homosexual, but acting on that. And he's really downplaying that, I think, because he wants a just dialogical church of encounter. He wants a poor church. He wants a church of the marginalized, and we're all marginalized in some way or another, right? Just some of us, it's more pronounced than others. So I think that's what he's getting at. But yeah, the idea of charity comes first, right?
This is our last question. We've looked backwards. We've looked in the present moment. This last question is a nod toward the future, and this is it. So today in the church in Belgium and Germany, those countries allow for the blessing of same-sex unions.
Right, yeah.
Do you see this as becoming a norm in the universal church? And the optimistic end of this question is eventually.
Yeah, I do, actually. I do. And I think actually, just from some of the, the ways in which Pope Francis has talked about some things that are very, very normative, historically normative, like, I think if it were up to Francis, we'd have ordained female deacons. And I think if it were up to Francis, he would really have some serious conversation around blessing same-sex unions. He wouldn't call them a marriage, but I think he would bless a same-sex union. Having said that, it's a complex web of intrigue in the Vatican. And so he has to be mindful of what is possible by himself and what is possible in the church. Do I think eventually we will bless same-sex unions? Yes, I think in the same way that we bless marriages that happen outside of the church. Right? And people come to the church after they've been married in a civil ceremony, and they say, we would like to have our marriage blessed as a marriage. And like I said, I don't think they'll call it marriage. I think it'll remain a union, but I do have hope for that. And I do have hope for female deacons, maybe someday priests, but probably not in my lifetime.
Well, thank you very much. Those were very informed and generous answers to some very different kinds of questions. So thank you. I'm now going to ask Jean-Paul Ruszkowski, a member of the St. Basil's community, to give a summary and a thank you. Over to you, Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much, Doctor. So, Dr. Kieser, I just wanted to start by saying that how impressed I am by, and I'm sure that everybody is impressed by, how you were able to put all this subject within a historical and social behavioral context. So I think this beautiful tour de force, as they say in French, I want to thank you for that. If I wanted to sort of summarize this very comprehensive and complex this conversation, is to say that, number one, that we are definitely at least I think Kevin summarized it well. It says, we are of a generation where we have a lot to make, a lot of adjustments to make in the sense of understanding even the relationship between spirituality and sexuality. I think the idea that you gave examples of Saint Teresa of Avila, I think was a perfect way of making that connection and characterizing it in a very concrete way. And I think for me that was a very powerful message that you conveyed. The other aspect that I take away from this is that we are living in an era where self-identity seems to have a much greater importance than we had, let's say, 25, 30 years ago, and how important it is for us to appreciate that requirement or the need by people to identify and be more comfortable with their own identity. And I think you've made a very good point in helping us through by sharing the vocabulary that some of us still have difficulties in mastering, but after your presentation, now we are much more aware. So this is the other aspect that I take away. That and finally, what really confirms the importance of this type of the conversation that we have is that we are always in an evolution. In other words, we are not a society or a humanity is not standing still. It's always moving, always learning. And for example, yesterday there was a very striking information coming from the James Webb telescope, which shows that, you know, there are far more galaxies than we ever expected. We have great difficulty understanding that magnitude and what does that mean for us. In terms of what I think the message I took from you on our practice as Catholics is that we have to be more open-minded, we have to learn more about it, and to also be patient with the rate at which the institution of the Catholic Church moves. So to me, this has been a very, very rich presentation, discussion, and I really want to say from the bottom of my heart that I appreciate what you did. And I'm sure I represent the members who have attended and watched you speak and all this. They probably are all very happy that you were able to make time available to us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay. I just want to thank again. She's already been thanked, but I really appreciated the idea that, you know, let's listen to Pope Francis and his suggestion that we become more that we listen to one another in a whole, like, let's enter into a culture of encounter where we encounter each other by deeply listening to one another. I think we have so much to learn from one another about all of these questions that we have. We're all questioning what's going on, what is the definitions, what's happening. And if we could only find a way to listen to each other, we would learn lots about what it is to be a flourishing human being. So one of the things that we do is my mother was Indigenous and an Ojibwe woman from Manitoulin Island in Ontario. And my nephews and nieces are trying to relearn our culture. So they're doing all kinds of things. And I have a niece who makes it a very important part of her life to do beading, to bead, to make ribbon dresses, all of these things to gain our culture back, you know, the culture that was taken away. So she beads for us for these series a little pin or a pendant or a necklace, something like that, to give to our speakers as a way of showing gratitude. And she's made this for Doris Kieser. Can you see it?
Yes. It's a wild rose.
Yes, that's what this is. So you can see it?
Yes, it's
There's a-
lovely.
There's a pearl. So this is it's going to be on its way to you, Doris.
Oh,
And part of it is gratitude for what you've done and all the efforts it took for you to, of course, your talk didn't happen overnight. It's been years in the making. Your presentation to us, years of study, devotion, reading, prayer, conversion, all of these things are of what it's a distilled version of all of that effort that you have, which is part of your life. Thank you for sharing it with us. And that's it for this season. Tune in again next fall. Hopefully we'll have another season of these Zoom series of talks on things that matter to us, conversations for our times. Thank you, and God bless you all.
thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.